This is House Planning Help, episode 382. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and try to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Ben Nother from Hawkland. We're going to be exploring the role of principal designer. What is it? What do we need? Is it something we can do ourselves? We'll explore all of that in a moment. I just wanted to check, though, first, that you're subscribed to our YouTube channel. The reason being because then you'll get automatically notified as we put new videos online. For example, we've returned to Hazel Tree House in Herefordshire to talk to Janice and Colin Gardner about what they learnt from doing their low impact project. In fact, it's an award-winning project. They've also written a blog post for us, so that goes hand in hand, and they reflect on some of the takeaways of having gone through the whole process. So we'll put some links to that and also our YouTube channel in the show notes today. Let's get to our featured interview with Ben Nother from Hawkland. We're exploring the two roles of principal designer, essentially. One looking at CDM, health and safety, and the other complying with building regulations. It can get complicated. We'll try and keep things as simple as possible. I started by asking Ben to tell me a little bit about his background.
I come from a family of builders. Ultimately, my grandfather was a bricklayer. My father was a bricklayer. I started life out as a labourer, bricklayer's labourer, in my early teens, working on a variety of sites. Always been in building and construction. When I then, a little bit of a push to go into the professional side of things, when I came to go to sort of university. My father at that point had progressed through to site manager and then up to being a sort of a quantity surveyor for housing associations and things. So he was very much sort of pushing my brother and I into the professional side of things, but went through sort of architectural education in a couple of different institutes, went to the University of the West of England here in Bristol, and then went to the Centre for Alternative Technology for my part two, because at that time a couple of friends had been and were on the cohort the year before and sung its praises, and we're all sort of looking more at sustainability and sort of the climate challenges. And I thought actually as a part two course, it delves into that really, really well. I then worked in a couple of different practices here in Bristol and did a bit of freelance work for some people as well. And after, I think, 5 years of working for sort of various companies, I had my first child with my wife and was working a lot. So decided I would try and go it alone, and formed my own practice, which was just myself, so I could kind of work from home, share in the childcare responsibilities that little bit more, rather than doing sort of a 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. day and not really getting the chance to enjoy life with a 1-year-old and my wife. A few years into that, I met back up with David Copeland, who is one of the other directors of Hawkland, who I was at CAT with. And they had a couple of straw bale projects and came to me to look at doing and supporting them with architectural services. We then just formed a very good working relationship that over a couple of years, they became a good majority of my work. And it was a natural fit for me to join Hawkland for Hawkland to be able to provide a service through all the way from sort of architectural concept design to build completion. So Hawkland in and of itself, it is a design and build company. That's one route that we run through. We're an architectural practice. We've expanded our architectural team. So it's not just me. Amber, who we work with closely as our architectural assistant, a couple of freelancers as well that we've worked with, technicians that we work with, to be able to offer sort of a full architectural package. But then that ease of transition over into the construction side of things by staying kind of in-house with our team, with our project managers, with our site managers, and with our dedicated sort of build teams.
You've mentioned all sorts of interesting things in there, and I'm very tempted to go off piece. I suppose I'd just like a couple of quick things for people that don't understand. What does design and build mean?
It's a bit of a generic term, and design and build company. So if you search for design and build in the town, the city, the area that you're in, you may find a couple of more construction focused companies who will provide what they call a design and build element. But ultimately, what you're doing is you're contracting one company to deliver everything for you. So you're going to them to do the design of the interventions or the new build or whatever you're looking for, but also then take it through into the build portion as well. So they are the contractor. A lot of design and build companies don't have an in-house designer, whether that's an architectural technician, whether that's a draftsman, whether it's an architect. They usually contract out to other architectural practices. And actually, I have done that for some companies as well. So it became sort of not necessarily their in-house architect, but their kind of go-to practice that they would sort of use for their jobs. And it allows them to do a couple of things, and allows us at Hawkland to do a couple of things. It allows that continuation of communication. So we know what a client wants from those early concept feasibility sort of meetings where we're discussing the options for a project, but you have that continuous person with you. So on our projects that we are doing design and build on, I am involved throughout the projects. And it may not necessarily be me doing the drawings. It might be our architectural assistant, Amber. It might be technician Joe that we're working with. But it will be me kind of overseeing everything that happens. That will then move over to once you've got a completed design and you've done all of your technical information, that will move over to our build team. We don't differentiate necessarily between our architectural side and our build side in our, let's say, back end processes, because everything we want to do flows through those kinds of things. So our other director, Chris, he's already up to speed on a design of a project when we come to start putting construction prices together. I'm involved a little bit in inputting some of those construction prices together as well, because we've already done some feasibility assessments on budget and what we're designing. So we have a point we can start from in terms of construction costs, because we've been developing those all the way through, knowing the type of build that we will be delivering, knowing the level of build that we will be delivering. Unlike a slightly more standard procurement kind of route where an architect does a set of drawings and then you go out to tender to 2, 3, 4 different contracting companies. And the way that they would go, okay, we can see how you would build in this sort of way. And you find this more on smaller jobs, perhaps, where you're going to sort of more independent contractors rather than larger companies, that they will go a little bit off plan, let's say, and they will build things slightly different to how they are on plan. And as we move more into talking about principal design of building regulations and CDM, we can talk about the pitfalls a little bit of the way that doesn't allow for a nice, smooth transition of information, especially into terms of operation and maintenance of a building. But design and build essentially is there to allow one company to kind of see through the entire project.
So you've got cost has got to be a really nice thing that hopefully you've got a good grasp on that. You've got one point of contact, which again is nice. Are there any other big benefits? I'm sure as we get onto this next bit, we'll see as well, but that just stand out.
I think and I will always say this to a client who isn't looking at, say, using us for a build. They've got, someone else that they like already. The relationship is really important. You've got to be able to trust your builder. You've got to be able to trust your architect, your structural engineer, every professional and every person that you bring into your project. You need to be able to trust, because they are delivering probably one of the biggest spends you will ever make. So you've got to have a level of trust. And I think design and build, or at least the continuation of using one company, allows you to build that level of trust. We're doing another project, a retrofit project, where we are very, very open with the client. It allows for much better flow of information in terms of being reactive to issues. You can open stuff up and realize that things aren't where they should be, or things are in a place where they shouldn't be. It allows you to then be able to have a very seamless conversation about those kinds of things. We still have internal processes where we're sort of following the RFI or architect's instructions sort of methods depending on the contract that we're working to, but it is much quicker to come to those kinds of answers. So it stops things like hold-ups on site. Suddenly if everyone's got to leave for a day because you assumed a bulkhead in a building had contained a steel, and actually it's just a bulkhead with a couple of rotten timbers in, suddenly you've got to come off site, you've got to get the engineer out, you've got to get everyone off of site so things stop. Whereas I think with design and build, we can be a little bit more ahead of that. We're not sort of reactive, we're more proactive in terms of being able to do a little bit more investigative work and kind of understand some of those issues that may kind of come up, but also then allowing us to go, great, I will go to site today and I will drag the structural engineer with me, rather than saying, when can the architect fit in coming? When can the structural engineer sort of fit in coming? Just to be clear on that, we don't have a structural engineer sort of in-house, but I'm quite persuasive when I need to be about trying to get people out to site to come and investigate these kinds of things. So I think it allows for a more seamless build process as well.
Maybe you could just introduce what we're going to focus on today all around safety, with this very confusing title as well, Principal Designer. But I'm interested, why did you pick this area? Well, there are all sorts of processes that must go on at Hawkland. So why is this fresh in your mind?
It's something that we have been training ourselves up on over the last 2 years. We were already kind of into the principal designer role under CDM, but the new Building Safety Act, which has come in, has slightly awkwardly, but I can understand why they've done it. They have also chosen the title of principal designer. So just to delve in a little bit, a principal designer for the last few years has been a person who has been more focused on CDM.
So hold on, CDM, a little bit of jargon here. What is CDM? Is that safety, effectively, what you're saying?
It is. It's through the Health and Safety Executive. It is all of the things you have to do to ensure health and safety on site. So a principal designer would look at all of the design risks within a building and have a look at saying, well, we know that you're working at height. So there's obviously, we're identifying your working height, doing some work on a roof, you're working at height. We've identified there as a risk. There's no way of designing out that risk because you're working at height. We can't put a Velux in at the ground level. You have to be up there to install this. Do you need the Velux? Is there a different way of delivering in terms of design the same effect? No, there's not. Great. We can't design it out. We've identified the risk. That list of risks then goes over to a principal contractor who can put in place the relevant health and safety, scaffolding, harnessing, those kinds of things. The principal designer identifies a risk and passes on that information as a really brief summary of that side of things. The Building Safety Act introduced the idea of principal designer in terms of building regulations, and actually that the now old process of building regulations was that an architect would put together a bunch of information, they put together a bunch of drawings, and they would say, this is the thermal performance of what we're doing. Here's the structural engineer's calculation, so it meets with the building regulations. Here's the fire strategy on a set of drawings, which would generally go over to the local authority or to an approved building inspector for them to have a look at and assess. The Building Safety Act has changed the sort of the responsibility chain. So the principal designer is now more liable for those building regulation sign-offs. You can take advice from companies and people like that on this stuff, but you are in essence, or the principal designer is in essence, sort of signing off the building regulations or co-signing off the building regulations. And we do this a lot with approved building inspectors or the companies that we've worked with previously, where we kind of co-sign off the building regulations. So we are presenting all of the information, as much information as we possibly can, with regard to sort of the material choices that we're making. And we'll delve into that maybe a little bit more in terms of sort of natural materials and things, which we tend to sway towards as our construction materials and our palettes, our material palettes. But you're looking at how your build gets that building regulation sign off by working closely with a principal designer. And the Building Safety Act, as I say, changed sort of the liability in that kind of way because it suggested that the best person to sign off building regulations is a designer. They are designing your building. They know what's going into it. They know the performance that it should achieve and should meet, rather than them passing that responsibility on to somebody else, basically, either to the local authority, to building control and people like that.
So you mentioned co-signing together. You've said it in the last couple of sentences, but just want to underline it. So is this really a liability thing that when you're signing it off, it's just saying everything is in order?
It definitely feels like it. The change has only recently come into effect last year in terms of, so we've got projects that started running where an approved inspector had already been appointed and is running through, and they are the ones that are signing off that project because it had already started before that transition period. Whereas anything after that is us providing much more evidence to say where those building regulations are coming into effect, how we're achieving building regulations with certain things, and then the approved inspector looking at it and going, yes, we understand where you're achieving this. You may get into that situation where they go, we don't think that this meets with the building regulations. How are you going to sort of rectify that? And it's similar to the old sort of system where building regs would still do that and say we don't actually think that this meets with the fire strategy underneath the regulations, let's say, because you need closers on your fire doors or for some example. And you would come back and go, great, actually we will amend our information and now we will highlight in the approved documents why we've put this intervention in here. We can say under policy X we have done this to meet with that. So you're evidencing a lot more rather than just kind of taking it on faith, let's say, that the builder will enact what you have put in on your drawings and then the approved inspector will come out and then sign off that. You, as the principal designer, are the one going out and then inspecting what has been built, what has been done. And you don't have to necessarily do this through a design and build process. Lots of architectural practices and some other kind of organisations, things like structural engineers, may provide that principal designer role, but they will be the ones coming out and going, yes, we can see that you have built to the standards and the build-ups that we have put forward, which we know meet with building regulations.
For you specifically, is the principal designer normally one person all the way through the project?
No. It's an interesting one where we get, as Hawkland, as an organisation, we get a lot of people come to us because Hawkland historically has been a contracting company. We get people come to us, maybe at the end of stage 3, they've got their planning application. They're then looking to get some input on the actual construction of a building. A couple of projects which we've had in recently, we're just tendering for. We've got a full package of information already that's been taken through technical design. And we might come in and say, actually, we would amend, drawings 1, 2, and 3 because we would like to swap out material X with material Y. And the other architects who are working on the project who have done that information, or the structural engineer who's put that information together, would in essence be the principal designer. And then we as Hawkland, if we're just coming into contract on a project, would take on then the principal contractor role, which any contracting company should be doing when they're coming in to do that kind of build. But actually we don't always sit over the top of the principal designer role. One project which we're tendering for at the moment, the architecture practice who we've worked with before on previous projects, will very much sit over that principal designer role. But they have been taking it through from concept all the way through, because they'll be doing contract administration as well through stage 5 on this project. But where people have come to us and then we take over the design work, so someone comes in with planning and then we say, great, we can design it through from stage 4, we would then take on that principal designer role as well. But under the new Building Safety Act, you're kind of looking for a handover from the previous architectural practice. Someone who has, or previous designer who has put together the stage 3, the planning application information on any identified risks that they've already designed out or haven't been able to design out. So they've identified the risk that's kind of there. So there should be a handover of information if it is not one person taking it all the way through. It's ultimately why I like design and build, because we have, and taking a project through from concept all the way through to completion, is because we have that responsibility all the way through. We know that we're not working off of someone else's information, that we can put together a very robust set of both CDM and building regulations information to make sure that we're compliant with all of the regulations that are needed, rather than trying to fill in gaps, let's say, or come up with additional information if something has kind of half been designed already.
So in that design and build scenario, just repeating my question from before, Is there an advantage to being a principal designer and having one solid person the whole way through, or not really, because you're moving on to site?
So you retain the principal designer whilst it's on site. It is key for it to be the same person, absolutely. It is someone who is familiar with the project. They'll be familiar with the risks. They'll be familiar with the other parties that are coming in to design certain things. So as principal designer, you're also overseeing, and as architects kind of do anyway, to a certain extent, you're overseeing any of the other designers that come in on a project. We work with a bunch of different companies, and they are doing design elements, so things like underfloor heating design, things like MVHR design, and we're not doing those services design. Someone else is doing that, but we then, under the principal designer, have the responsibility to make sure that company one is competent, that they know what they're doing, that they have all of the relevant insurances and qualifications and those kinds of things, to make sure that the design that they are putting forward is compliant and is safe. It's not just me going, oh, we'll put a vent in there because that's where it seems the vent should go. You're actually looking to other people to do that design level for you, but making sure that they are of a quality to be able to deliver that as well. And so having a principal designer in through from all the way through as one person is key, because they know all of the different moving parts on that project. They know all of the companies that are coming in. They know all of the designers that are coming in to a project. And they might not know them necessarily, but they can do enough research into them and have those discussions with those companies. If a client wants to use product number one, we can go, great, let's go and talk to them. Rather than me, if I come in at a later stage and then suddenly we're just given a bundle of information, we've got to read through all of that. We've got to go through all of that information. If we designed the stuff, we've been doing that. So you're not doubling up on work, because if someone's already designed something and they've been through that process, we've got to go through that process again. So ultimately, it does save a little bit of money, because you're taking that principal designer through all of the way. You're not transferring over responsibilities. You're not transferring necessarily that level of information over as well, which needs to be double checked. And there is always a bit of an additional cost when people come to us at the end of stage 3, or we're doing some stage 4 information additionally to stage 4 information that has been produced, because we have to take on the design responsibility. We're taking on and making sure that the person who has designed it before has designed it correctly. We are being liable for anything that we then design on top of and then go to build. So we have to make sure that we're happy with that information. Whereas, as you say, sort of, Ben, it's kind of, if you've done that from the off and you're running that project all the way through, you have that ease of information. You know what's going into your building already, and you have all of the relevant information for it.
Now, I will move on at some point, but I've just got some more questions here. So, not design and build now. If we're just talking about someone who's going to be traditional architecture firm, small scale, and by default, I'm assuming they will be the principal designer at the beginning of the project. But let's say the onus is back on the self-builder or what have you. Am I right in saying that they won't be able to get everything signed off until they assume this role of the principal designer themselves?
So it's interesting, because under the CDM regulations for health and safety, ultimately, everything, the client actually is the most responsible for everything. And under one of our projects that we're running at the moment, under CDM, the client is able to put their responsibilities, client responsibilities, onto us as a principal contractor. So this is one of the projects that we're building as well. So the client is protecting themselves by bringing in the right kind of people to deliver on the project. People that have got the relevant qualifications, they've got the relevant paperwork, insurances, everything like that to be able to deliver. And this is, we've done a bunch of projects where we've designed something for people and they've gone, actually, I'm going to have a go at doing, you might come in and do the structural work for us. You might build a weather-tight shell for us. We're then going to go on and get other contractors to come in and do stuff. We get this a little bit where we're working a bit further afield. Let's say, a straw bale build, which we did a couple of years ago over in Essex. And we delivered sort of the majority of that build to a weather-tight structure. And then the client then takes on those responsibilities. But we have sat in the background to be able to provide them. And this was under the old system because it was a few years ago, but we have provided those drawings over to the building regulations sort of authority, although I think it was approved inspector for that project. But we provided them with the drawings up to sort of technical design stage. So they then came in and kind of assessed the project from that point. And I suppose they're not a consultant role for the client, but they are able to talk the client through that. So that this client was doing a bunch of the work themselves and were able to have further conversations with us. You know, we didn't just sort of leave them at that point. We've had conversations with them further to sort of some of the internal finishes that they're looking at and how that stacks up through. I would say self-build is an interesting one because if you are self-build under planning is a different terminology than I would think self-build is. Self-build under planning is you're just having a house built for you to live in. Ultimately, it's how you get over things like sill payments and those kinds of things under the sort of the planning. And I've done a lot of that for people where they've gone, we've got a plot of land, we want to build a house and live in it. So under planning, we are self-builders, but we're getting a company to come in and build it for us because we're not builders. And those sort of two different ways of whether a person is going, actually, I'm going to build this, versus we're getting a company come in to do it. So the people that are getting a company to come in, they're protected. People that company's taking on that principal contractor role. The designer or the architect who's designed it themselves is taking on that principal designer kind of role. People more in that, what I would think most people think is the more self-build sort of way, where people are actually going to have an input and they're going to be doing part of the build themselves, if not getting specialists maybe to come in and do certain elements. They would be taking on a lot of that responsibility. So if they're doing drawings, if they are doing some of the build themselves, they are liable and responsible for all of that. Ultimately, they're responsible for it meeting building regulations. They're responsible for the site being safe in terms of health and safety, which they may or may not know about, sort of the right processes in place for site inductions. You've got another contractor coming out to deliver one specialist element. They've got to be inducted to your building site. They have to know where all of the risks are around the building site, where it's safe to work, who else is working on site. Lots of those processes which come with a construction project. Get advice, I would say, in that sense. So if you're looking at designing something yourself, you might want someone just to sense check your drawings, your designs for you. So going to an architectural practice and saying, look, I've done a lot of this, and I think architectural practices in general are very open to the client having a really heavy hand, let's say, in the actual design process, or we have clients who come to us with layout plans already and say, I want my building to look like this. And we go, great, let's help you achieve that. But we can then take a view on it and say, actually, you're looking at using this material, so you would need to provide this level of information on it to make sure that it is and show that it is meeting with the building regulations. Actually, this material that you're using has these restrictions about it, which mean under CDM it needs multiple people to lift, or it needs specialist gear to lift into place, and that kind of stuff. So people who are self-building and doing a lot of the work themselves won't know a lot of this. They won't know that, item number one, okay, some of it's common sense. Big item needs more people to lift. Great, but how do you do that safely? They might not necessarily know that kind of thing. So in terms of self-builders, you just need to bring in the right people at the right times to check for compliance and things like that on what you're looking at doing.
Can you give us a couple of examples of material choices and things like that, and how that will impact the project? Because it's quite hard to understand. I know you started the conversation talking about straw builds, but do you mean if they're panels, they'll be lifted into place, all this sort of thing, so there's a risk there?
Yeah, I suppose it's identifying the materials and the build-ups that you're working with, whether it's natural materials or whether it's any kind of materials. You have to identify the risks with installing that. So with a straw panel, with a timber frame and sheathing boards kind of thing, you've got to lift them into place. They're too heavy for people to lift. So you need cranes, specialists, lifting gear to get those things into place. You would need banksmen potentially for the crane kind of coming in, dependent on the access sort of for the site. There's lots of considerations around just that one construction type that need to be taken into account, rather than just, great, I've got some panels, I'll just bolt them together. How do you get them into place? How do you do that safely? Those kinds of things. But then on the building regulation side of things, do they meet with the performances that you need them to meet with? Are they structural? Great. The company who have produced them will provide you with that level of calculation to show that they meet with that regulation. How do they react to fire? They'll have their fire classes and things like that. So all materials will have this that you're able to sort of go out and buy and use. Things like straw, we get a lot of straw direct from farmers. But we know that straw reacts in certain ways based upon studies that have been done, based upon fire tests that have been done. If those bales have been baled to certain conditions and those kinds of things. So the information is there even for some other more natural materials that kind of may be used. But a lot of the natural materials that we use have already been certified in those kinds of ways as well. So you look at something like a wood wall board. Wood wall board from many different manufacturers, they have that level of information that you look to use. So you can use that instead of using sort of a plasterboard, or look to use it in certain situations where you've got really limited access or build-ups and you're looking to sort of protect a sort of a wall build-up or something like that. Then you can go, great, we know that we want to use these natural materials. Here is a bank of information for us to be able to present when someone turns around and says, I don't think that material meets with fire safety. Great, here's the information which tells you what fire class it is, and we can tell you that under this situation it only needs to be class B, and this product is class B. And there's ways as well of talking to manufacturers. So you don't necessarily need to go through an architect, let's say. But if you go to the manufacturers of the products that you're looking for, they will have standard build-ups. And they will say, well, this meets with all of the regulations. This build-up meets with everything that you need it to. So as long as you build it in this way and you use the products that we are providing, with then saying, we've got ancillary products, we've got this membrane. We don't provide membranes, but we can suggest that it needs to be of this performance. Great, you can go to manufacturer number 2 to find that membrane of that performance. So product-wise, all of the information is out there, and a lot of what we do is collating that information to be able to sort of present it for building reg sign off, but also then identifying where it might need that more specialist handling on site, or it's a liquid, it's a chemical or something like that. How do you safely store that on site? You have got at least with an architectural practice who's going through a heavy specification sort of process, you've identified all of that really early on. So you know what needs to be done on site, health and safety wise. You know what needs to be evidenced with building regulations, rather than just going, I've bought a bit of board from down the road, I'm going to use it on my building. Is it safe? Does it meet the performances that you need it to kind of meet?
So if we fast forwarded to the end, this is all about safety and making sure everything's competent and there's compliance going on. But what might be, if this had all been done badly, what might happen at the end? Are we talking about collapse of buildings, or, are there any examples from when things go wrong?
Luckily, we don't really have things go wrong.
Well, not from you.
I mean, in general, yes, absolutely. If something hasn't been designed properly, for an extreme example, if you are working on an existing building and say you don't consider the existing foundations or the existing footings, and on a lot of historic buildings there won't be much there, and you then go, great, let's put another floor on this building. You build in the loft. You're imposing a lot of weight on the existing building. And that building may only be suitable, the foundations may only be suitable to, because you say, well, this building's been here for 150 years, it hasn't moved. There's a bit of cracking that happened the first 10 years, but nothing's changed since then. Great. You're then imposing a lot of load onto that building and onto the existing structure of that building. So that could result in a full collapse of that building because you've put too much weight on it. So coming in and going, actually, the intervention here is not necessarily a supporting steel frame, which might be if you're opening out the back wall of something, and obviously a steel frame to the right sizing and specifications that's kind of needed to take the weight of the property, but going, actually, do we need to underpin this? Is there a way to improve the footing of the building to be able to take that additional load? A lot of times with existing buildings, even when we're putting a steel frame in, you're putting a big old concrete pad underneath that steel frame to be able to transfer the loads correctly. And if you don't do that, the building will sink into the ground a little bit and then it will fall over. If you're not using the right materials for fire protection, for fire compartmentalization, there is a chance that fire will spread much more rapidly because you haven't used the right materials. The fire is not being contained, or you're not protecting an escape route through the building. And a lot of this, the Building Safety Act has kind of stemmed out of Grenfell, and obviously a really, really bad and extreme sort of case in that sense. But the materials that we used weren't evidenced well enough and weren't tested well enough, weren't specified well enough from the sort of the reports that have come out for the use that they were being put in for. So yes, if you build something badly, or you don't necessarily build it badly, but you don't use the right materials, it can end in collapse of a building, which or fire spread, which can lead to loss of life. Absolutely, it can be that bad.
Let's just rewind again. So we're talking about the safety as you go through the design process, and you being an architect, this is going to be quite helpful. But do you do your designs and then do all the safety stuff before, just as a final step, or how does it integrate into the process?
We have been integrating it more and more as early as possible. So we know on a project, say a client goes, I want a balcony. Great. What are the health and safety risks around having a balcony? Well, there's regulations about how high balustrading should be, how high the balcony itself. You've then got fire safety. Is it an escape route? How high off the ground is it? Can it be classed because it's X distance away from the normal escape routes? Can it be classed as an escape window because it's a door out onto a balcony? There's all sorts of regulations and health and safety concerns that come up even with one design intervention. We're out of the realms of going, great, it's a balcony, that will be lovely, to being like, great, that will be lovely, but what are the considerations around that? We need to know that straight away. We need to consider that straight away, because that might impact on design interventions throughout the rest of the property, because there is a risk. We've identified that risk. Great. How does that impact on that? Because otherwise, if you don't do that, you then go to your technical design stage, you go through to building regulations, and they say, well, there's a big risk here because you put a balcony on the side of the building. And you go, oh, well, we didn't consider the health and safety risk of doing that. We now need to change the design of the build. Well, the build's already been started. So you're impacting on what's happened, potentially at a cost to the company that are doing it, because you haven't considered that already. You can't then just go to the client and say, well, we didn't consider something, and now you need to pay an extra £10,000 to make the building compliant. That's going to be on the designer. That's going to be on the contractor, dependent on sort of, whether it's a design issue or whether it's a sort of a build issue. So it's really important to get ahead of those sorts of things, to identify kind of the products that you're using. And old sort of method is, great, we've designed something for planning, it looks like this, we haven't really considered what it's being built out of. We have those conversations straight away now. We know what products we want to use from concept design, and we talk to people a lot early on about what those build-ups might be. And generally clients haven't considered the minutiae of what those construction build-ups kind of are, and it gives us an opportunity to come in and say, well, we would like using these materials because of the health benefits of them, they're natural, the embodied carbon within those kinds of things, getting into those kinds of conversations, but also then going, great, we can use these materials and we know what the impact on the building is for risk, but also under building regulations as well. So getting in really early on those elements is key, I think, moving forward. And it will always change across the scale of a project. So if you're doing a little renovation, you're doing a knock through of a wall or some spaces, you're doing a rear extension, that scale of domestic kind of project, there's obviously a lot less consideration needed because there's a lot less moving parts. If you're renovating a full property to NFIT levels, or you're doing a passive house kind of level build, there's a lot more moving parts, there's a lot more materials, there's a lot more processes that you need to go through. So it's a much bigger design process to get into that sort of part, rather than just, oh yeah, I've drawn a box on a drawing, that's the window, great. We split the mullions and the transoms and the way that the openings kind of happen in this kind of way because it looks nice, rather than actually this is an escape window and you have certain requirements that need to be met for that window to act as an escape window. So it's kind of key to get in early and identify a lot of that.
Let's move on to the site then for a second. And we talked about a few of these things, working at height, also induction. What about things like well-being on site, stress, mental health? Does that factor in, or is that really irrelevant?
No, it does factor in. Absolutely, absolutely. Hawkland, as a company, pride ourselves on our sites being inclusive, safe, not just in terms of health and safety, but safe in terms of, welfare. And under CDM, there are certain things that you need to do, welfare provisions and things like that. But actually, not just meeting the minimum that's kind of needed. Does there need to be a toilet on site? Yes, there does. Great. Is that kind of a porta potty outside 20 meters away from the building that if it's absolutely hammering down, as we've had on some of our sites, it's just been snowing and snowing and snowing. Is that porta potty 20 meters away from the building? It is. So you've got to trudge through the snow. You've got to sit in a lovely cold space just to be able to go to the toilet. If that's built into your welfare unit that's on site, and some of these smaller projects won't have that level needed, but if it's built into your welfare unit, it's there to be able to use. You're considering how your site is set up to better help the team that are going to be there. You're also, and we do this occasionally on some of our buildings where it is a more domestic sort of project. Actually, is there a room where we can set up a tea station, where we can have our table and chairs, where we can have our health and safety folders that doesn't impact on the use of the building for people who may still be living there, but you've got to have those spaces. A lot of the time in Bristol, when you're working on a terrace property, the streets here are very slim. There's not a huge amount of space externally. So actually you have to try and consider an internal space to provide your welfare. One of our projects, we were renovating sort of the back space of a house. And actually the clients very kindly gave us the front room. They were kind of in and out of the property. They moved in with other people for a little bit whilst the heavy elements were being done. That's sort of the site side of things. And we very much have a big push towards, for our site team at least, a 4-day work week as well. So our team can have slightly longer weekends to take on other little projects and things like that if they want to enjoy having time to themselves. And we operate on a slightly longer work day. So our team are doing that little bit extra over 4 days. They're not making up a whole 5th day across those 4 days. We're not working them 10 hours a day over those 4 days. But we find with our build teams that we attract people who want that bit of flexibility, who want to be working in these kinds of environments where we are considering their welfare and their safety on site.
I've certainly heard stories about, I think, roofers having particular struggles. I don't know whether that just comes with the profession there. I've seen some people running projects who I wonder, you've got a lot of stress on your shoulders and I'm not sure how you're dealing with it. But equally, other things on site, what if, say, for example, I've seen people standing in massive great holes and thought, this doesn't look safe. So what can we do in those scenarios when we're not happy with how things are going?
So as a client, if you're not happy with things are going, raise it straight away. And if you're mid-project and your contractor has someone in a big hole and they've got no way of either getting out, or there's a digger sat next to that hole and you can see that something could go wrong, you as a client have a responsibility to raise that actually. But it should be then the contractor is responsible for the safe workings of your site. And if you don't feel that contractor is meeting with that, talk to them, get them to do better as a first sort of step. But actually you're well within your right to tell your contractor, you are not meeting with CDM regulations. We don't want you on this project anymore. And it's a hell of a process to then try and find another contractor. Lots of hold-ups in terms of trying to get someone to come in, and you might not have the affordability in terms of time and cost to do that, but you can absolutely talk to your contractor. No company should be closed off and say, well, this is the way we do things, so this is the way we're going to do it. We find more and more when we're talking with contractors, if we've just done architectural drawings for somebody and they want to use a contractor, contractors are massively open to changing their processes, to making sure they're safe on site, because ultimately the penalties for not working safely are quite significant. There can be heavy fines, there can be jail time for not considering the safety of your team on site, or not having processes in place for not considering and making your site safe. So it's definitely one that if a client sees something, they should raise it. If you've got an architect or you've got a principal designer, raise it with them. We operate in a way where we have a site manager Lots of contracting companies will do this, and they are responsible for the health and safety on site. Everyone's responsible for health and safety on site, but they have the overseeing eye a lot of the time on health and safety on site. But we also have a project manager assigned to a project, and they will go out and also assist with that. So they'll do weekly checkups, they'll do 2 sort of weekly inspections just on health and safety, making sure that things like scaffolding has the correct tags on, that's been inspected on a weekly kind of basis by the scaffold company. And lots of these people will have been vetted beforehand as well. Can we come and see a project that not necessarily you finished, because that's great and you can see the level of finish and the quality that a contractor might do, but actually what are they like on site when they're working on a project? Come out and see that, that scaffold doesn't look great. Oh, okay, they're doing that off of a tower rather than having a full scaffold around. And sure, that might save me some money, but it isn't safe. Being able to really look into that. And as Hawkland try and assist our clients with those vetting processes as well. And we've worked with contractors to do specific elements who, haven't necessarily had the right level of insurance cover. And we go, well, we can't work with you. And they go, give us a week. We'll go and speak to our insurance company and we'll get that sorted. And that back and forth of talking with companies is really, really important. And I think that draws back to the idea of going design and build almost, and having that continuous thread of someone on a project who has identified risks, who knows what's going on, who knows the design, where you need other companies to kind of come in and be able to have those conversations with them. Hard, I think, in some senses for a client to almost directly go to people to potentially save costs. If you've got a contracting company overseeing a bunch of subcontractors, you'll have a bit of an uplift on the work that the subcontractors are doing because the contractor is managing that engagement and they are bringing them in. Employing someone directly might save you some money, but you don't know necessarily how best to kind of vet them. And you might think, well, they're going to come in and they're just going to bash it out in a day. They might not be doing that safely. And sure, you're saving some money, you're saving some time, but you're putting yourself and you're putting the people on site at risk because it hasn't been assessed correctly, it hasn't been processed correctly, and it hasn't been programmed correctly.
Now, I don't know whether this is a silly question, but I'll ask it anyway because I like silly questions. Is the role of principal designer insurable?
Yes. Absolutely.
Okay, well, that's a quick one there. And then finally, what else should we be asking or covering? Is there anything we've missed out in this conversation?
It's such a big topic. There's so many kind of moving parts to both health and safety on site, to getting a building compliant under building regulations. So just in terms of the principal designer, and I think I mentioned sort of earlier, I can see why the Building Safety Act has called the role that they have produced the principal designer, because building regs and health and safety, they do go hand in hand. It makes sense for whoever is the principal designer under CDM to be principal designer under the Building Safety Act. And the Building Safety Act has baked in part of its legislation which says the principal designer has to be a designer. So it's going to be your architect or it's going to be your structural engineer ultimately. And all other designers have to agree that the person who is being principal designer is a competent person to do so. Under CDM, you can still use other companies to provide that principal designer role. So they can come in and be sort of an independent principal designer, which in some sense I like the idea of, because you're working with a health and safety company, and this is what they do in and out every day to support you. And it might be that the architect is still the principal designer under CDM. You're just looking to get an external contractor to come in and provide that level of support, but the responsibility and the liability is still lying with the design company. But it's stressing the importance of this role now, that it is something that not everyone will know about, especially self-builders. They may not know that X product needs a certain level of handling, or that you shouldn't be mixing, say, metal work, strapping of roofs down with a lime plaster because of the way that the metal and the lime sort of work. You kind of need to, whether it's a light touch from a designer, come in and have a look at how you're looking at building your building, how you're looking at trying to do things like processes, but then for them to go, actually, under building regulations, this wouldn't work. The processes for building regulations and for CDM are complicated. It's really hard just to do it by yourself, I would say. And it's key in bringing in competent companies and competent individuals to be able to help you deliver your project. So I think that's the thing to sort of stress the most. It's not something that I haven't touched on because I think I've tried to stress it throughout.
Well, the conversation will roll on, but Ben, really appreciate that. Loads of interesting things here and lots to chew on. Thank you very much.
No problem at all.
We've been making the notes so that you don't have to, and you can find them at houseplanninghelp.com/382. There's a summary there. Also, if you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, we encourage you to get interactive. We'll give you links. We'll link you to Hawkland. Once again, houseplanninghelp.com/382. Let's close up with a shout out for The Hub, and this is our membership community. We like to take the learning further, give you a helping hand, and it's designed if you're looking to produce a new build or retrofit an existing property. Just make it a low energy home, lots of lovely materials, healthy, comfortable, all the usual. So surround yourself with like-minded people, others who are on this journey as well. It's a great information source in itself. Stay accountable. I've got weekly calls so you can chat with me about your challenges, about your next steps, maybe tap me for resources, contacts, etc. And we've got courses. We've got training from guest experts who come in and inspiration in the form of our in-depth video case studies, which really take you through the entire project, focusing on all the decisions being made. So get more information about The Hub, houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, a beginner's guide to making a comfortable home. We've done hundreds of podcasts and sometimes they can get lost in the archive, so we're coming back around. Different guest though, Andy Mitchell from 21 Degrees. I'll be chatting to him. Thank you so much for being there. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.